So this is a moment where I feel like maybe I should just sit down and I can leave you with the impression that is read in that statement, and then just have informal conversation. But I really would like to demonstrate some of the things that Angela described, and to thank Angela for joining me for dinner last night. Jim and Todd, we had a wonderful conversation about social science and its future, our intentions here, and what we feel are our obligations and our goals. And so I found it quite informative. It was a great late night. And so, so should I say something that, needs further explication, don't be shy and drawing me out. But it really was great fun and a really rich conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to share in this work today. I'm going to aim to close about 12:40, 12:45, so we have enough time for questions. I did spend, it turns out, I spent 20 years at the University of Chicago, but really is actually over 20 years. So I think that's an important, precision is a good thing. But it meant I spent a lot of time with University of Chicago economists. And so I'm very used to people chiming in when they have a question or a point of clarification. So I'm comfortable with that. I'm also fine if we want to save those questions until the end, and I understand that's more generally the norm. So with that, I want to discuss what activity space is and think about urban-rural comparisons. So what are my aims today? I want to visit and revisit the extent to which health might affect or be affected by activity space, and I'm going to define that and also think about how it affects social interaction. I'm going to use just a quick example of some of our work thinking about racial segregation and trying to reframe our analyses of racial segregation that move beyond residential location. I want to lay out a theoretically informed approach that might suggest new methods, but I do want to make sure that the methods are not in search of a question. So in my role at ISR, I think a lot about social surveys. I think a lot about their survival. I hope we'll talk about that in the Q&A. It's one thing that motivates the use of ecological momentary assessment in this work and the use of GPS level data collection. But I want to also think really carefully about what informs our question. How do inventive methods respond? And I have a close friend who was in NASA for years and years. And so I was telling him about this work, and he said, well, you have to make sure that it's mission pull rather than technology push. I thought that was useful, right? In thinking, I don't want to just employ GPS and EMA in lots of different contexts because it's the method that I know, but I want it to be driven by new theory that helps me think about why space matters, and particularly why space matters for health. So what do we mean by context? So I'm going to describe a sociological approach to our understanding of the impact of place. People in and across places in real time, we think about limitations in the characterization of space, the breadth and depth of it. What's our circumference of turf? I mean, maybe you could all quickly think about what your circumference of turf is in the day, all the different spaces you inhabit, and whether or not they are influential in your life. So I want to think carefully about the microenvironment. I want to ask whether new methods can provide insight into what place is, how it's perceived, how it matters for health. And I am particularly interested, as Angela stated, in an aging population and the role particularly of social isolation within that population, of isolated individuals who live in isolated households, embedded in isolated neighborhoods. So drawing a bit on Wilson's work and adjacent research that suggests that that form of isolation has important implications for lots of different kinds of outcomes, particularly health status. So I want to say a bit about research on neighborhood effects. How many of you would consider yourselves neighborhood researchers? We're interested in neighborhood-based research. Great. I often like to invoke Jane Jacobs at this time, and I'll talk a little bit about her later, but she was an important motivation for some of the ways we're talking about activity space work. How many of you have read Death and Life of Great American Cities? There might be a generational divide in here, but I suggest for those in the back, it's a great read. Anyway, theoretical approaches largely neglect the actual spatial exposures and patterns beyond our residential address. So I want to incorporate aspects of social disorganization theory, again, with a social ecological approach that does come from Jane Jacobs. Much of her work, this notion of eyes on the street, is that familiar to people? So older adults and communities engaging in informal monitoring, it evokes this notion of somebody sitting up on the second floor of a walk-up, looking down on the street, seeing who's interacting, who isn't. who might belong, who doesn't. That might be a more problematic indicator. We can talk about that perhaps in the Q&A. But this idea that the rhythms of life can be observed by others, and there's something about that rhythm of life that makes people feel secure in their surroundings. So she contributes to that, but she also contributes this work on this notion of a web of public trust. And we see that as adjacent to collective efficacy theory, which I'll talk about in a moment, but this idea that right, social cohesion, informal social control, and communities matter for how integrated people feel, whether they go inside or outside. Many years ago, I spent a lot of time thinking about who lived and died during the Chicago heat wave, did a neighborhood-based analysis, and at least our analysis suggested that people were much more likely to die if they didn't live near an active business district, right? Which both drew them outside, we think, made the street safer, but potentially had resources that they required during time of duress. So that's sort of, where some of that is going and what has influenced this idea of activity space. So we want to incorporate that conceptualization and again, emphasize age and aging. How many of you think that your circumference of turf shrinks as you age? So what's really interesting is that the data don't always suggest that. And it's much more heterogeneous than you might imagine. That people, as we grow older, actually we become more differentiated rather than less. And there's a lot of evidence that some lives become quite expansive as they engage in caregiving, volunteer work, other types of activities. So our hope was that work of this kind could address something that would sort of a common belief, but not necessarily evident in the data. But there is some idea that neighborhoods and the networks within may be more consequential for older adults because they've lived there a long time, right? By and large, and so they're more connected to community. Great, so this is just a very general schematic on neighborhood-based research. So again, this really emerges through social disorganization theory, thinking about neighborhood structure, how it relates to neighborhood outcomes, both the individual level and the broader population level, and what are those mechanisms. So, we draw on research, not surprisingly, from the Chicago School, Sean McKay, Park and Burgess. There was a really nice reissuing of The City, where Rob Sampson wrote this great introduction to what was still robust about thinking of the city as an organism. But we draw on some contemporary elaborations to this work. Again, Rob's on collective efficacy theory, the ability of the community to come together for the common good. Scogan's work on disorder, Wilson's on institutions. I already flagged that a bit in thinking about institutional processes within communities, and also this role that that isolation might mean that institutions aren't able to actually serve the needs of those within community because there aren't effective modes of communication. Anderson's work on culture, and Barbara Entwistle on population processes. So we try to bring all of this to bear in thinking about what neighborhood-based features might matter. I draw too on Mary Patillo's work in thinking about how you can have a focal neighborhood, but if the neighborhoods that are adjacent to it are not of the same level of economic resource, that those neighborhoods might draw from it in a way that that makes that neighborhood potentially not so effective for the people who are resident in it. But just to be attentive to that matter, my colleague at Chicago, Luke Anslin, has done some really nice work helping to think about how adjacency in particular can be dealt with statistically. Angela, didn't you do some more? I think you were for Luke, right? So you know what I mean. But one of the things that has been really harder to address is this floating neighborhood out there on the right. So how do we incorporate information from a neighborhood that is not adjacent? How do we think about that statistically? How do we think about it conceptually? I worked with a graduate student at Chicago who did some really nice work in Elizabeth Gomer, who did some great work in Queens, where she actually had people draw their neighborhoods. And she had them draw the neighborhood and then their household. And about half the respondents put the household in the center and drew a neighborhood around it. Another quarter put their household in a quadrant and then drew the neighborhood. But another quarter altogether put their household in one space and then their neighborhood in a completely non-adjacent space. So what does that mean for all of us? How do we think about that? Can the places that are influential in our lives actually not be the places where we sleep at night? So that's a qualitative indicator that some of the direction of this work might be useful. So this is our synthetic model, and this is really one where we think about how all these factors matter for health. Again, structural indicators of community, segregation, poverty, residential instability, and race and ethnic heterogeneity, and then thinking about the quality, density, dispersion of amenities. Again, that comes a bit from the work of Jane Jacobs. Population density, immigrant concentration. How does that lead to the use of local amenities? Does that then lead to a street that is animated? Do those overlapping routines create a sense of solidarity in community, social cohesion, again, informal social control that makes communities health enhancing? And again, I note these ideas of web of public trust and the expectation of street support and control and how they relate to the notion of collective efficacy. And here I'll just say this is a set of places individuals come into contact with as a result of their routine activities. And I should say too that one of the things I hope you'll help me with today is to think about how these theories could be adapted, drawn out, enhanced when we think about the context of rural life. And one of the things within at least sociological discourse that it seems we have observed as a team is that there isn't as much engagement with research on rural life. And I'm not so convinced, I guess, that urban sociology is all that open, that a lot of it is about density, a lot of it is about social interaction. And so I would really like to see the enhancement and growth of research in the area of rural life. I think we would all say that that what we've witnessed politically in maybe even the last decade, the increasing bifurcation in political stance by urban and rural location is quite puzzling in many ways. And I will say within the context of ISR, and Jim House and I are trying to mount a study on rural life that's large scale, there just aren't data to be able to explain this increasing bifurcation. And so my imagining is that social scientists won't need to cite hillbilly elegy anymore, right? And that would be nice. It would be nice to cite other, and there are, of course, really great sociological works that focus on rural life from an ethnographic standpoint, but it would, I think, be nice within demography if we spend a bit more time thinking about the structure of rural life. And so, again, I hope that you'll help me think about how this model might be enhanced for that form of work. But let me tell you how we're using actually this research project to mount a new project on rural life, and that's what I'll do in about 5 minutes. I'll start talk about that, but I want to tell you a little bit about the chart study. It comes from a grant called Activity Space, Social Interaction and Health Trajectories in Later Life. Lots of colleagues from Michigan, OSU, Chicago, and Cornell, and then a really helpful advisory board that's been useful in thinking about all the ways that we might want to get at notions of neighborhood social context in neighborhoods that we pass through but do not reside in. So these were the specific aims for this first project, and this started in 2016, 2017, to fill out primary multi-wave data from 450 Chicagoans aged 65 and older. So for demographers, this is a pretty small sample size. It's a sample size, it turns out, of an R01 budget. So we got what we could. But what's important is that we have data points over 3-week intervals 5 times a day. And I'll get to that in a moment, but you don't need to do EMA 5 times a day for anyone who's interested. 3 is enough, right? So good to know. We conducted in-person interviews to obtain baseline measures of self-reported objective health, BMI, physical mobility, use the smartphone app over, as I just said, over week-long periods to identify latitude, longitude, distance traveled, to describe our activity spaces, and then used EMA to identify day-to-day fluctuations and leverage extant information. I won't talk about this piece today, but if anyone is interested in this work, we partnered with Argonne National Labs on a project called Array of Things. I had a colleague there who agreed to put sensors in all the neighborhoods in which we drew sample. So this was great. Those sensors were able to get at lots of different measures of air quality. They also did this thing that's just pretty extraordinary, which is that they took a sweep of the streets and then they transmitted essentially the objects that they were able to assess. So they could tell if it was a person or a dog or a bike. So they didn't transmit the image, but they transmitted the read on what was on the street. So this allows us, for those of you who are interested in researching criminology, to think about things like, is there a threshold effect on the street? And whether you might be more likely or less likely to see crime on a street given density. And so you were able to characterize it in that way from the Array of Things project, but I won't show you any slides from that today. But we were able to show that for the neighborhoods in which we drew sample, much higher levels of carbon monoxide, other kinds of poor air quality assessments. And so it was interesting to see that there was so much variation across small space in the city of Chicago. The EPA, just as an aside, has 3 air monitors in the city, and we had 200. And we showed extraordinary variation across small space. So that's just an interesting thing to keep in mind. Yeah.
Just a clarification on the photographic or visual scan you did. How is that different from like Google Street View, or why didn't you just use the existing Google Street View data?
Well, we could get it continuously, which was really nice. Yeah, so it's on all the time. And one of the things that I think is really interesting within this body of research, and this isn't something I focused on directly, but time of day can be everything in many of these neighborhoods. And so being able to look at how the shift in interaction matters by time of day is kind of an extraordinary thing. It was also nice because it's an adaptable device. So because it came out of Argonne, there are a lot of people who are interested in things like cloud cover and rain and other sorts of things, which we could imagine maybe relates to things like depressive symptomatology or something else for the kind of work we do. But that was what was extraordinary about it, was really it was on continuously. Okay, so this is really just a schematic showing you the kinds of data we collected in the in-person questionnaire. And I want to share this slide just to remind that we had 3 waves. We actually had a 4th wave and 2 smaller waves embedded in that through the COVID period. I won't show you the COVID data today, but if anyone's interested in that or interested in analyzing it, let me know. Because we were trying to look particularly at questions of social isolation. But we do have biomeasures and yeah, we did dried blood spots much, using some of the direction you mentioned, Angela mentioned NSHAP earlier. So we used direction from NSHAP in order to collect those dried blood spots. So we don't have a lot of cases, but we have a lot of waves of data. Great, so these are our Chicago neighborhoods. Como Mercateg helped us develop the sample just to show you that, because I know it's a little bit small. So for those in the back, the blue relates to responding to a Black, Hispanic, orange community that we would consider mixed in some fashion is purple, white dominant is yellow. And then we tried to break it out by SES high or low, just so we should get some important variation. Chicago, for those of you who don't know, it's a very segregated city. And so we really needed to be purposeful about how we drew that sample. So these are our 10 neighborhoods. It's Fuller Park, Englewood, Calumet Heights, New City, East Side, Lower West Side, Humboldt Park, Irving Park, West Ridge, and North Center. So really trying to get at variation in the structure of Chicago neighborhoods. And again, this is our EMA approach. We did 5 survey periods within a 7-day period with 3-week intervals. And we did the 3 weeks because Chicago's also got, pretty god-awful weather. And we wanted some seasonality in there to see if that had shaped at all where people went. We did an incentive experiment where we either gave people $1 for each EMA or $5 for a threshold 3. Which do you think was more successful? Anybody? You might be puzzling because it didn't matter. It actually didn't matter. What matters, what turns out to matter is that people, about 70% of our respondents were very faithful with the EMA. The other 30% pretty uneven. That remaining 30%, we still tracked with the GPS, but there were some people who sort of fell off. We do think 5 times a day, again, was probably, too many. I will say and this is well, I'll get to this probably when I talk about the rural research too, that about 70% of our respondents spent most of their time at home. So they are an older adult population, but as I've been talking, I feel like I've been talking a lot about age in the last 24 hours, but I don't feel like they're that old, they're like 65 plus. So some people are still in the labor market. There are other, and very actively engaged. But I think it is really interesting, particularly our low income communities. This gets back, reminds me of Pat's work and thinking about stuck in place and other things, that you have a lot of older adults who are not just, not leaving the neighborhood, they're not leaving the house. Okay, so I just wanted to show you quickly, this is what our EMA looks like. The kind of basic, this comes from theory of Csikszentmihalyi, who was in psychology at the University of Chicago at a key point in which he developed sort of the notion of flow, which was his popularized version of thinking about ecological momentary assessment, but this idea that you give your in the moment assessments rather than something that's retrospective. So are you depressed rather than were you depressed over the last week? I do want to tell you a result related to that. And then one of the things, and Rob Sampson helped us think through this, how do you try to capture collective efficacy theory or these kinds of measures to places you pass through, rather than those you observe every day. But, it's kind of this notion of, do you have a vibe? Do you get a sense of community? That's what we wanted to try to capture. We also wanted to ask some pro-social questions, people of different ages, different races, people smiling and saying hello. We wanted to get at that too. So positive and negative forms of local interaction. And I just wanted to quickly tell you about one paper we had come out recently where when we ask people about momentary loneliness rather than a retrospective assessment, much more likely to report the incidence of momentary loneliness. And men were much more likely to report than women in this context, or at least the differential between the retrospective assessment and the in the moment assessment. And there's some literature that suggests that men underreport depressive symptomatology or notions of something like loneliness. So we think that actually loneliness might be something that's more momentary than we imagine, right? And so can be captured in methods like this one. Okay, this is just a schematic showing you what our EMA responses can look like by neighborhood. So this is where we geolocated those EMAs. That's really helpful for other analyses, because then we can ask people, when you were located here, were you alone? Were you with others? Were you scared? Were you lonely? Were you content? We get all of this kind of information where people are standing. But this sort of quickly, Aaron York Cornwell developed this map, and I like it because it shows, right, some kind of tighter and looser neighborhoods, if you will, and I think that dispersion is interesting. Again, most of what I will describe to you today is descriptive, but I think helpful to kind of get a sense of the work we do. This is also work led by Aaron, patterns of social contact by race, ethnicity, and education. This comes from the baseline survey. All network ties primarily rely on face-to-face interaction. This is when you're with someone else and with someone else away from home. And we see these really interesting gradations by educational attainment. So less than high school in both sort of with someone else, that's close, and with someone else away from home, much less likely to be embedded in that social network at higher levels of education. This is controlling for lots of individual level factors. But we also see this in the in-person social survey when you ask about whether your ties rely on face-to-face interaction. So that's an example of what we can get out of the EMA work. And this is to show you what our activities look like. This is our Wave 2 data. I hope you can see this mostly in the back of the room, but I'm going to tell you kind of the key walkaway points. This is where everybody is going in the course of that week. And one of the things that I really want to point out here, and for those of you not familiar with Chicago is primarily white density up here, African-American, Latino on the west and south sides. But what you see, particularly a place like Irving Park, which is dominant white, for routine activities, people go north or they go, to Wisconsin. On the south side, east side, which is primarily African-American, Englewood, they're going south or they're going to Indiana. So one of the things that we think is interesting heuristic here is that people don't seem to be colliding, right? These lives seem like pretty separate lives. That's something that we're working through right now. We have a paper coming out in social forces. This is led by Leon Kai, who's a graduate student in sociology. This is just one small piece of the paper, but I wanted to flag it in part because I wanted to say he's got this paper coming out on social forces. I know for those of you who are interested, you look at his work. But what this is really telling us is that our older adults, our African-American older adults, whether they work or don't work, and depending on whether we adjust for the neighborhood in which they lived, they're not spending very much time in white space. So there's this notion that comes more from research on adolescence. My colleague Chris Brown has been leading that, that suggests that compelled mobility is what gets people, it puts African Americans in white space more readily than whites in African American and Latino space because they're not seeking amenities in the same way. We see that's less the case for older adults. And so we think it goes back to this notion of social isolation and the extent to which older adults are rarely leaving their homes or communities, at least in the lower income neighborhoods in which we have data. So with that, I am going to start talking a bit about how does all this matter for rural life, you might imagine. And I know I have maybe like 17 minutes or something. So I'm going to probably whip through this pretty quickly. It's mostly descriptive. But on that note, I think it's important for demographers to engage in descriptive work and to engage in pilot research. And Jim and I were talking about this a bit last night. Very little done in rural areas. We want it, does activity space, does the approach matter in rural areas? Can we do it? Will it work? So these are some things that you're probably quite familiar with in terms of characteristics. It's defined by exclusion. That becomes important in a moment. And poor health, higher smoking, obesity, physical activity, serious mental illness. Why do we care about rural social context? I've really motivated this. How is it depicted in the absence of representative data? And that's something we really want to focus on. And this is our new study. Has anybody heard of the Great Smoky Mountain study? Anybody who does? So this was a discovery. Joe Hodson and I discovered this work. Some of you know Joe is an economist at Duke. He's now shifted to the University of Chicago as of February 1st, if anyone tries to find him. And we were interested in thinking about studies where we could look at the transition, midlife transition. Some of that is motivated by your colleagues, Angus and Anne, right, who are thinking about deaths of despair. And we wanted to be able to look at that in a rural context, you know, given that there is suggested work. So the Great Smoky Mountain study it looks a lot like Ad Health. It was started in the 90s with kids between 9 and 11 to look at psychological well-being. And so let me stop there and I'll show you a little bit more about the data, but we want to ask about these questions of despair, questions. Joe's really leading this effort on the gig economy. Where are people working? How are they working? And to compare that to national studies. So this is where it's located. And what's important here is that we have a really nice, it's a sample of about 1,400 respondents, including 350 from the Eastern Band Cherokee Indian tribe. It's one of the few studies that has longitudinal data, and we have data over 11 periods from, again, the ages of 9 to 11, and now those respondents are in midlife. I'm flagging that book, but as many of you know, also from popular media coverage, opioid use really high. It's high in our participants in the Great Smoky Mountain study. And then in Appalachia in general, the diseases of despair are quite high. I show this again as motivation. This comes from the Great Smoky Mountain study when it started and in its waves. This is only to age 30, but as you can see, these kind of notions of things that we might consider despair or despair-like are increasing over time in this population. And this top line is any despair. So that's really to motivate the idea that there is something for us to examine here. These are the data that we have. I won't go over this in detail, but if anyone is interested in these data, I'd love to tell you more about it. We have 12,000 assessments of these individuals, community representative, very low attrition because it's had the same interviewers over time for you who are interested in survey methodology. And a lot of genotyping for those of you interested in the intersection between the biological and the social. And we're introducing some research on neighborhood context into this new wave. So how will I answer my question of whether any of this can work? And I spent a lot of time talking about the Chicago study and why that could inform research on rural life. We did use a lot of those methods and accompanying protocols to engage in pilot data in Appalachia. We argue that urban contexts have been favored given intensive protocols. You know, people always worry about cell phone coverage, access to Wi-Fi. But I might argue too that, you know, given the location of many university contexts, for lots of reasons, and I would say this is true for the Chicago school, you know, you study what's proximal for many different reasons, including practical ones. And so comparative work between urban and rural areas, right, has not been something that has been dominant in the literature. And so, you know, we're aware of these challenges, but we wanted to ask whether this would work. Here's our sample. So we have a relatively small sample of about 182 respondents. They come from a study called RAISE, which Rick Hoyle is the PI. He's also from Duke University. And then we use some of our Great Smoky Mountain study sample and to again see can activity-based methods work in this context. And so we did this during the pandemic. One point I will note here is that thinking about collection via GPS on a phone and using some form of app is really great when you can't have contact with respondents. So in our Chicago study, we mailed people phones, a relatively low income and older population, so many didn't have smartphones. In the Great Smoky Mountain study, all of our respondents, I think, except for a handful of which we gave phones, have phones, and we were just able to push out an app. So it's a very cost-effective way to collect data, which again, in my administrative role, I care a lot about, and a lot about trying to develop. So we modeled our data collection here, day 1 to 7, completed brief surveys. This time we only went with 3 a day, and then we had a day 8 overall assessment of how the day unfolded and the week unfolded. And that was, you know, typical compensation for an EMA-related study. And as I said, we drew a lot on the chart project, which I just described. So this is what our images look like. So you receive this notification, tap or swipe. When you tap it, you get something that looks like this. Who are you with? This is actually, where were you? Became somewhat of a, controversial is too strong, but a question in our pilots for the Chicago study that we were quite surprised by. That we had a focus group and one of our respondents said, oh, every time you ping me, you catch me alone. And so she said, the last time you pinged me, I got in my car and I drove back to church so I could fill out my EMA at church because I didn't want you to know that I was alone. And I'm not alone all the time. You just catch me when I'm alone. So it was this interesting for us, a really interesting thing to think through in terms of how we make sure that something like that, which would seem relatively straightforward, isn't stigmatizing in some way and causes people to alter their behavior due to the instrument. This is, I kind of threw this in because I was really interested in the generalizability of the collective efficacy concept. We changed very few words. Like people around here are willing to help their neighbors. We kept that. This is a close-knit community rather than this is a close-knit neighborhood. We generalized the terms. I just threw in a quick street plot, but it behaves very well in rural context. So that was in particular something I was really excited to see. Again, because I want that to be sort of a core of some of this comparative work. I'm going to walk through some common metrics. These are just, again, descriptive. These are the sorts of things when people engage in GPS related sorts of work. You want to know that census tracts visited, the buffer space, the convex hull, and a general standard deviation ellipse. So just, you know, telling me about your circumference. For those of you not familiar, the buffer space is in red. We spend a lot of time thinking about buffer space. It sounds like it wouldn't be interesting. I'm realizing as I'm hearing myself say it, but it's actually really interesting because let's think about what it means for you to be home. So to be home in an urban area may be very different than to be home in a rural area. If you're on a farm, you know, are you at home when you're on, you know, acre 200? When you're in a high rise, are you home when you're in the building but not on the floor? How do we characterize home? We spent many months thinking about different ways to assess that, but this is just a schematic. But it actually really matters whether that buffer is at 20, 50, 100. And we've spent a lot of time thinking about validation around that. And then we get our convex hull, which is really bounding that. And this inserts the convex hull within the standard deviation ellipse so that you can get a sense of what those two different kinds of metrics are capturing. Might be very familiar to most of you in the room, but just wanted you to know where we were going with the data. And this is just, these are the kinds of things we would go through. What does the buffer space look like? The unique tracks visited, so a high correlation among the samples, chart more than our rural sample, in large part because we think we have a little more data, but it's denser in our urban setting. And potentially, we collected some of this during the COVID lockdown, and that might reflect that too. But these metrics, they're important to kind of think about these metrics as a bundle because they each capture a slightly different aspect of activity space. This is one thing that we've also spent a lot of time characterizing what is rural space. We looked at a review of 103 articles that assessed rural life, and they used 11 different definitions of what rural is. So there doesn't seem to be sort of an agreement in the literature. We used RUCA codes here, mirroring some of that literature, and that includes, concepts like population density and travel patterns. Okay, this was I mentioned this in our early morning meeting. This was the thing that was puzzling to us, and I will spend probably the next 3 or 4 minutes, and then I'll close on this point. So we have those who by RUCA code, and this is really just focus on our UCC codes are really at the county level, and they mostly focus on commuting. But we have this very interesting group of people who live in what is characterized as an urban area, but say that they are rural. And so what does that mean? I was kind of looking at people, what does that mean? We can say that in a few minutes, but this is quite curious to us in terms of why. So we've spent a lot of time in our project. More recently, this is again the work with Bill Copeland and Joe Hotz, thinking about what that means. So this is just, again, a schematic that shows you, so these in the darker circles are people who characterize themselves as rural, but live in urban space as defined by RUCA codes. So one of the things that I think this is helpful in terms of viewing is just that it's not that those are all people who are adjacent to rural space who are making this claim. Some people are kind of squarely in what is characterized as urban space. And this is going to be very small, so I'm sorry about that. But what I'm going to share here is I'm just going to describe, what this table is aiming to get at. So what it does is it bins people who consider themselves rural, non-rural, and those who are only a self-report. Like I say I'm rural, but I live in urban areas. What's striking about that is that people's perceptions of, is this area rural? Their perceived cost of living, quality of healthcare, perceived diversity, proximity to goods and services, subjective social status, and financial insecurity align between the group that's actually rural and the group that's urban but thinks it's rural. And so we find that quite compelling, that they characterize themselves in that way. And we can maybe get a bit into what I mean by think they're rural, but just to use that as a shorthand. This one, not as much activity, but levels of drinking, which are actually lower in rural communities, and among the self-report, but anxiety levels reported as higher, again, for those who are rural and those who claim to be rural. Anxiety levels are higher. And this is, I won't go into this slide in detail, but I will just tell you that what this is saying is also their patterns of activity are very much the same. So that means that again, those who claim to be rural and those who are rural, they're moving in very much the same manner. So their standard deviation ellipse is much more similar and very, very distinct from those who are urban. So I'm going to skip that. I think what I will do is close here and just say that one of the things where we are trying to sort out in this slide was who's spending time at home and who's spending time in other census tracts. And so one of the things that I think is fascinating here, and goes back to our work on race, is the extent to which our respondents don't seem to be crossing paths at all. So those who live in rural areas are mostly in rural tracts. Those who live in urban tracts, mostly in urban tracts. You see a little bit of crossover in the rural areas for those who are probably seeking amenities, but not so much. And so you think, you know, again, I flag our politics of late, but are we living in right societal circumstances, again, where our daily lives are as bifurcated as our residential locations, which I think is I think is a compelling question. I think I will stop there. I had a little bit of, we did a little bit of work trying to look at places of interest. Where do people go and do they differ across these locations? And this is a bit suggestive. These are the only locations we could pull at present where we're thinking about educational institutions, churches, and things we could get from OpenStreetMap. But the patterns don't look so different. But this is work we're continuing because we thought perhaps that's a driver for why we would see you know, people making a claim about a particular residential location that they're not inhabiting, or that we are perhaps characterizing ineffectively. And I'll stop there. Thank you.